Hello, this is the RPG Pundit, the final boss in internet shitlords. Before I get started today, a couple of little programming notes. First of all, tomorrow, be sure to check out the Inappropriate Characters channel for our October show, which is going to be, I guess, Halloween themed. It's going to have a lot of interesting topics that will be kind of topical, of course. And there may be some costume wearing involved, maybe even a sombrero wearing RPG pundit. And of course, we hope Venger will be going in the form of the infamous character that he is a dead ringer for, Curly from the Three Stooges. I don't know if that's what he's going as, but he ought to, because obviously it's his easiest go. Second of all, as I've mentioned a couple of times lately, I'm still looking right now at possible publishers for my upcoming book on the Crusades and the Silk Road. And if you are a gaming publisher and you're interested, you don't have to be a big gaming publisher by any means. You just have to publish something in RPGs that I can see what type of work you've done. And you can get in touch with me and maybe negotiate. So keep that in mind. I'll let you guys know when I've settled on a publisher, but for the moment it's still open. Anyways, today I'm talking about something very relevant to RPGs, and yet that is obviously from a bigger scope than being just about RPGs. And this is that, lately I've run into some geeks who are quite despondent over the fact of the constant attack on every aspect of their pop culture in the form of SJWs taking control and warping and defacing what makes all of those different parts of geek culture great. And, some people have become quite depressed over this. And what I wanted to say today is, I think in the form of a certain reassurance coming from someone who is a historian, because historians, we tend to look at the long term and the big picture, some of us more than others. So, from the point of view of a historian, I've always said, I've said it before on this show that I'm still pretty convinced that the novel is a new idea that isn't particularly good, as far as literature is concerned. It's only been around for like 300 years. So anyway, here's what I'm trying to get to. All the things that you love about, or most of the things you love about most of the parts of pop culture that you care about are going to outlast the SJWs. They will be forgotten or a footnote of tragic proportions in some, historian's book sometime, when the things that you actually care about will still continue to be around. And the reason for that has to do with precisely the difference between kind of novel or literature versus myth and legend. The problem that SJWs have is that they're trying to deconstruct the fabric of a culture, and to do that they have to destroy myth and try to demean it, even, right? To make it intentionally a subversion of what it's meant to be about, in order to ruin it. It is an intentional act of ruination that they're doing. And the clever ones of them know this. There might be some particularly stupid ones who think I'm making things better when they're not. They're just making everything worse. But that's something that can only really have a short-term effect, because that sort of alteration doesn't have the power to overcome the power of myth and archetype. Now, how do I know this? I know this because we just have to look at history to understand the example of that. So let's start by talking about what, how it is that myth is myth. Not everyone will be able to recognize myth at the moment of its creation. You kind of have to be trained to spot it. You can recognize sometimes that something becomes very popular, but something popular isn't necessarily going to be myth, right? It has to have other characteristics. So it requires that you be something of an initiate, I guess you could say. And yet, that's when it's starting, right? But everybody can kind of end up recognizing what myth is 500 years after it started. And that's because that's the thing that's still around. So Star Wars, at the time it came out, was derided. And, there's still some brainless academics who just deride it as silly pop culture or something like that, as just a stupid, robots and lasers movie or something along those lines. When they failed to capture the fact that it was the birth of a modern day myth. And 500 years from now, or 1,000 years from now, Star Wars will still exist. Even if, let's say that even if it's a society, there was some kind of societal collapse or maybe a super evolution, and all of the material in which the movies that we had that were made in the 20th and 21st centuries, that material was lost or was unable to be used in 1,000 years, the story would still exist. People would still be telling the story of Star Wars, but that story that they would be telling of Star Wars would not be the story of the prequels, and it would not be the story of the sequels, that's for sure. It'll be the story of this part of Star Wars that is myth, which is the original trilogy. That's the part that will live forever. And the rest, probably along with a lot of other stuff, the expanded universe for a start, but also stuff that hasn't even come up yet, stuff that hasn't been made yet, will be stuff that will, with maybe very few exceptions, that might become also sufficiently mythical as to end up becoming included, because there can be stuff that is added later and that becomes a part of the myth because it reinforces the myth, but not if it diminishes the myth. That never gets added. Nothing that diminishes the myth ever remains. Only the stuff that makes the myth better and stronger as a myth, not as a story, as a myth. So those will be the parts that people will know. The rest will either be completely forgotten or it'll be a footnote in some, historical literary analysis or something like that. Superman will be as remembered, 2,000 years from now as Achilles or Hercules are remembered today, because it will be that level of myth. So almost everything that is the thing we care most about geek pop culture is because it is myth. Those myth parts of geek pop culture are going to survive and thrive. We might be about to have a Chungus encounter here. So those are the things that will persist. If you look at the ancient examples, those things remain, right? And we've seen this in all kind of aspects of myth. So what does it take to make a myth? Well, a myth has to be constructed with two fundamental parts. One is that it has to be composed of archetypes. And that's because myth is a timeless experience. It transcends the time of its creation. So you might have really good stories, really good novels. There are tons of really good stories of different kinds that were created all through history. There's tons of really good novels that were written even in the 1930s or even later, that were good, but that nobody reads today, right? That no one cares about today in the least bit. And that's because they weren't archetypal. They were products of their own time. They were the characters, and the story and the relevance of it was limited to the context of the time of its creation. When you have a story that consists of archetypes, of archetypal characters and of archetypal events, these have a quality that speaks to the human experience that transcends the limitation of the time and space in which it was created, because it ties into some of the fundamental experiences of being human. And that's also part of the reason for like the global success of things like Superman and Star Wars. These things tap into something that has an effect beyond the culture of its birth. And so because these archetypes do not represent, they're not meant to be realistic presentations of people. They're meant to represent some kind of an ideal. And that's the other part of myth, is that it also has to tell a story that has a value. I don't quite want to say a moral value, because there are some myths that have things that are not necessarily, good moral lessons or something like that, but that rather it tells you what you have to do, or how you have to be, or how things have to be, and why, right? So they are instructive without being propagandistic, right? Without being indoctrinating. They're instructive by their very nature, because they immediately tap into something within our subconscious that we already kind of knew, and puts it into a form that we can then make sense of via this story of this myth. And so all of these characteristics create the enduring survival of the myth. Now you might think, well, but in the modern world, it's different. These things people keep adding stuff to it. Well, it's exactly the same in the ancient world. There are probably shitloads of stories about Hercules that did not survive, and they didn't survive because they weren't sufficiently adding to the myth. We can directly talk about, getting closer to kind of Lion and Dragon period, the mythological aspects of King Arthur and of Robin Hood. The myths, because both of those stories were created over very long periods of time, over centuries, right? Like the earliest Arthurian stories are like more than 500 years older than the latest one, the last ones that were like part of the main canon, right? Like the Morte d'Arthur is done during the time of the War of the Roses. And the earliest stories are stories that come from before William the Conqueror, that come, possibly centuries before, from the Welsh culture, before the Welsh were conquered by the Normans, and mixed in with some elements of Saxon mythology as well. And so these stories, the core, the essence of the myth is not limited. Oh, there we go. We got a big chungus there. She's going outside to check out the rain. Well, she's not going. She's just looking outside. These stories start with this kind of core element of the archetype. And sometimes that core element of the archetype is not really the full-fleshed final version, because you can sometimes get additional things that come along that make the myth better, that make it stronger. And so those get added and they get included. The earliest Arthurian stories are very raw stories that if we only looked at them alone without, because most people look at the whole saga of Arthur altogether, right? And so you see the whole story of the Round Table and Merlin and Lancelot and Galahad and the Grail and Morgan Le Fay, and all of that is all there at once, right? But those characters are actually created over long periods of time by many little stories that went adding to the canon of King Arthur. And it's the same thing with Robin Hood, right? Like the earliest Robin Hood stories paint Robin Hood. I mean, they start with the fundamental thing is that Robin Hood is a rebel against unfair tyrants, right? It's not even King John he's fighting at first. It's not even the right time period, the one that we end up having. There were a bunch of characters that show up much later, even Little John isn't there right at the beginning, like at there are earlier characters that are there before that, and so the whole story of Robin Hood and his in the beginning, he's a little bit, like how at the very beginning of Batman, like in the very earliest Batman comics, Batman used guns, and then that kind of goes away. Well, in the earliest versions of Robin Hood, he was quite a lot more cruel in some ways to the people that he considered oppressors than he is in the final version of the myth. And why? Because in the final version of the archetype, Robin Hood becomes more of an ideal. Sometimes to maybe too great an extent. So like, the Robin Hood movies of the early 20th century, or the mid 20th century, the Disney movies or whatever. I'm not sure if it was Disney that did those. I'm not talking about the animated series. I'm talking about those movies of, where Robin Hood is this gallant, dashing guy who never actually kills anyone or something like that. Is very much a step too far, and that's not going to be the thing that really stays because of that. But the gallantry is something that will stay, So these stories develop over time, and they always develop towards the direction of strengthening the myth. And we're going to have the same thing happen with every part of geek culture that we care about, right? The stuff that tries to decay the myth is not going to survive. Only the stuff that strengthens it, only the stuff that makes it better. Just like, we've seen that in some ways in real time with comics, because there's a bunch of shit that's happened in comics, to Superman and Batman and Wonder Woman and to all these characters that really didn't fit. And so eventually, sooner or later, they kind of get forgotten. They either get removed literally from the canon of DC or Marvel, or they just kind of aren't talked about, because they're just not quite right. And so that process in a little microcosm of a few decades is also going to happen over a much longer period, And you might be saying, okay, but those are shows and stories and comics, but what about RPGs? And the thing is, I've always said, and RPGs aren't stories, obviously, they aren't for story making, right? What they are is a game. And the thing about a game is that a game has it's a game that you are creating a world, right? And you're creating adventures in that world. That's a tremendously appealing game. It's a concept that I think has enormous staying power. And it also has the added staying power that in a way it is less dependent. I've seen people say, I'd probably agree, that there could be some kind of an apocalypse or a cataclysm or something, and nobody would be able to watch movies anymore, and the comic books would have all burned up. But if one person survives who is a DM, D&D will keep being played in the caves or whatever, right? Like it's extinction proof, and the version of it that will survive, assuming the human race does, is going to be the version that is, again, the archetypal version of the role-playing game. It's not going to be the version that is completely topical to an incredibly privileged, incredibly decadent society that has turned on itself and is trying to commit cultural suicide. That's not going to survive. That's not going to survive decades. Some of us, I hope, will still be alive by the time when everything that these people have been doing for the last decade or so is going to be looked at with, like the same revulsion that you look at the Cultural Revolution in China. Even Chinese people look at the Cultural Revolution in China today, or what Pol Pot did, or stuff like that, or the way communism is looked at in Eastern Europe. That's going to happen. It might or might not happen sooner or later. But the RPG as a game is a game that by definition taps into one of the fundamental elements of myth, which is the hero's journey. And D&D is in many ways kind of the embodiment of the hero's journey. You literally go from zero to hero, right? From level 0 to being, a champion sort of demigod in the world, if you do the right things, if you pull it off. And again, not necessarily morally, though obviously a lot of RPGs could have very strong moral elements, and we tend to look at RPG play. Most people, when they're playing RPGs, play the heroes. There are obviously some RPGs where you might play monsters or villains or something like that, or just assholes. But as a rule, we tend always to come back towards the heroic, because that is something that taps into our human nature. And so this is something that is going to endure, and it's going to outlast any attempt to destroy it, right? You don't even need to have any venues to access this stuff except word of mouth. Unlike just like in if you lived, let's say, under some brutal regime, people wouldn't be allowed to buy comics or to watch movies or to listen to records that were not approved, right? But people could still meet in secret and tell stories and sing songs, and they could still meet in secret and play role-playing games, right? So these are the things that are beyond the power of the people that would threaten us with destruction, have the ability to touch. And I guess that's the essence of what I'm trying to get to here. So I guess that's everything for today. If you like this video, please subscribe. If you haven't subscribed, hit like, share it anywhere you think people will find it interesting. And if you, or where people will get pissed off about it too, that's great. And if you want to support me, I've got like a Patreon page, and you can just give money to Patreon if you like, but I'm not, I don't update it or anything like that. The way I prefer for you to support me would be to pick up my products, stuff like Lion and Dragon, which is now a platinum bestseller on drive-thru, World of the Last Sun, which is great gonzo gaming, and The Invisible College, which is a modern OSR conspiracy occult role-playing, which is doing very well, and it's a great modern take on the OSR rules. Kind of avant-garde, but utterly playable, as the people in my campaign are praising it. So yeah, check those out. Check out the RPG Pundit Presents PDF series. The latest one is out now, RPG Pundit Presents 106, which is called Perils of the Sunken Skyship. It's a gonzo adventure that you can run in any kind of gonzo setting. Obviously, World of the Last Sun would be one of them, where you're going on a trek on behalf of a wealthy patron to recover an artifact from a high-tech ship that is sunken under the ocean, being accompanied by world-famous aquatic explorer Jacques Chebleu, and having to face all kinds of terrible dangers, including deadly octobears. So, have your players this October face some octobears with Perils of the Sunken Skyship, or check out any of my other products, Star Adventure, Dark Albion, Cults of Chaos, great book, and Arrows of Indra. And and most importantly, just keep sharing the video and watching. Currently smoking. Don't know if I've shown this one ever before. It's quite an oldie. This is a meerschaum, handcrafted meerschaum, plus what's this called? It's Fox and Sons. No, I forget what it's called. It's a Fox and Sons really good Virginia and Oriental blend. Sorry, I can't remember the name. Fox and Sons. Take care.